Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming back after this short break. Also, thank you, Nikolai, for this invitation, which allows us to discuss with you all topics that we have been trying to develop rather for several years now, often in the intimacy of theaters or museums where we perform. I must confess or admit that as an actor and director, it is much easier for me to perform shows than to give you a presentation. Usually the text is given to me. I just have to learn it by heart. I don't even have to agree with what I'm saying. But here, the exercise is far more difficult, so bear with me. What could an actor and landscape possibly have in common? And this is a relationship that at first glance may seem distant. It is in a way the question Nikolai implicitly asked me by inviting me here. As I was reading the seminar presentation by email in a train crossing England, I looked at the landscapes passing by near York, and I wondered what the landscapes of Denmark could look like. Cold and dark, maybe. I must apologize, but I had no memory of them at all, despite having visited Denmark a few years ago to perform and having spent time in the city at night, but I couldn't recall its appearance. Then gradually, images began to emerge in my mind, fragments of images, in fact, of landscapes that had been told to me in a play. And I apologize in advance if this reference seems banal or stereotypical, but it is indeed Shakespeare's Hamlet set in the kingdom of Denmark. However, the images that came to my mind were not geographic or topographic landscapes. They were more mental spaces, alternative views of the mind. In fact, these landscapes reflected the inner states of the characters in this human drama. Far from resembling panoramas we can gaze upon, they were metaphysical landscapes born of the imagination. And Shakespeare indeed often uses the figure of hypotyposis, which allows the invocation of landscapes through language, bringing them to life in the Greek rhetorical tradition of enargeia, which means placing things before the eyes through speech, conferring a visual dimension to the text. A large part of my work as an actor comes from this practice, making appear the so-called otherworldly landscapes, meta-landscapes situated beyond the stage of theater. A famous example of this practice is the prologue of King Henry V, which you're probably familiar with, written in 1599, a year before Hamlet. And so you need to imagine the situation. The text was written for an actor to enter the stage at the Globe Theatre with hundreds of spectators gathered. Most are standing in the pit, while others, probably royal family members, are seated further away. The sky is wide open above their heads, and the actor, standing on an empty stage, seeks to capture the audience's attention to begin the show. And what is fascinating about this beginning is that before starting, the actor apologizes. He says, "Pardon, gentle soul, the flat, unraised spirits that have dared on this unworthy scaffold to bring forth so great an object. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden O the very cask that did affreight the air at Agincourt? Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France?" The text begins with a confession that the theater, with its modest means, will never be able to fit the entire world in its entirety. The spectators must then supplement its deficiencies with their imagination. Let us, on your imaginary forces, work. The theater asserts itself as a place where the world is created, not just to reveal it, but above all to assemble it, to experiment with it, and collectively represent the planet we inhabit. as well as its landscapes. And this is beautifully recounted in Frédérique's latest book. It is within this fully embraced tradition, and I believe I can speak for both of us, that our theatrical gestures are animated out of love for these simple and artisanal means with the capacity to create small worlds. However, the history of landscape on stage is gradually depopulating. This space, once shared with ghosts, mythical beings, animals, and forests, is now increasingly replaced by human comedy that is more and more exclusive. The landscape becomes the receptacle of a devouring humanity where human passions almost exclusively impose themselves. In 2009, I was a young actor raised in text-based theater, mainly with male playwrights. I had long been steeped in narratives where the human at the centers of passions was the only one to inhabit the stage. The actor is not at the center. He is the only place where it happens, and that's it. L'acteur n'est pas au centre, il est le seul endroit où ça se passe, et c'est tout. It's the only place where it happens, and that's it. That's the phrase with which I entered the National Theatre School of Brittany, a quote from the French writer Novarina. It's taken from his letter to the actors, and more than 7 people had to learn the letter by heart for the audition. They had to memorize these words, engrave them in their memory, in their bodies, to put them in their heads. And I won't accuse Novarina of self-centeredness, but as we were taught, it always nurtured a vision that was increasingly centered on the human, where the human was the only one to occupy the stage, and the stage even began to emancipate itself from the landscape as a backdrop. Humans floated in a terra nulla. Then one day, a new phrase, sentence, quotes hit my practice like a meteor. And now enters Gaia. This phrase first appeared in an article in 2009 when Latour and Äit-Touati introduced the figure of Gaia onto the stage of theater as a conceptual character. And it was not the first time Bruno Latour had mentioned Gaia, but it was the first time he chose to bring her onto the stage with Frédérique. The eruption of Gaia into theater is twofold, philosophical and theatrical. It brings a different kind of nature into play, a consistency of landscapes that change. No longer just an inanimate backdrop, but a full-fledged actor. And it's precisely here that Latour and Frédérique, by opening this door of the theater to Gaia, introduced a monster. Gaia, by invading the stage, carried us with her in the theater into a vortex whose center of gravity is no longer the same. So imagine the shock for a theater actor like me. It's a complete paradigm shift. We are in 2015, and at the theater of Nanterre-Amandier, we started a performance, a long-term performance called the Theater of Negotiation, Make It Work, which was a sort of pre-enactment of the COP21 taking place in Paris, where we were trying to reach an agreement to stay below the 2 degrees Celsius at that time. And the rules of the UN model had been overturned. Delegations were no longer state-based, but also included non-human entities. And I wanted to share with you this small anecdote because I think it's a good example of what it means to have Gaia entering the stage. During a general assembly, while we are confined in a black box, so the theater inside, the large doors of the transformable room, it's called the transformable room, suddenly open to the outside, and a gust of wind rushes in, sweeping away the many papers of the students playing the climate negotiators. And my table neighbor, part of the presidency, digs her nails into my arm, screaming, "This is impossible. What is happening here? This cannot happen, and we can negotiate in these conditions." And I replied, screaming also, "But darling, it's already happening. You just have to face it." And now enters Gaia. This phrase could continue as follows. Actors tremble for you will have to share the stage. Gaia's arrival on the stage of theater of the world has multiple consequences, already told countless times by Frédérique and Bruno Latour. But for an actor, it changes everything. The set, until then, which was inanimated, a stable base for human passions, begins to shake and react violently to our actions. We can no longer tread the stage as we did before. The set becomes an actor itself, but a partner whose intentions we do not fully know. Other non-human beings whom we had once encountered in our narratives, the ghosts, the animals, the forests, are now returning along with many others, but in a new way, with new agencies. It is they who push us to rethink our relationships, who weave with us bonds of codependence and interconnection. Human passions, which once dominated the stage, are also transforming into new emotion, just like in Nikolai's book, Land Sickness. New narratives emerge. Theater becomes a place where more than ever the relationships between human and non-human actors are redefined, where the boundaries between bodies and fragments of the world blur. And I might sound a little bit, happy-clappy when I say that, but it's far from a fairy tale. This is a transformation of a landscape. This is a transformation of a landscape weakened by profound changes, the relocation of societies, the wars on resources and territories, and the decline of biodiversity, as we have seen, sadly, in the past years. How, in this new cosmology, can we reinvent metaphors, narratives, that allow us to reinsert ourselves into the world at the right scale? To articulate here is not only to speak, but also to build. It is a challenge of eloquence, both scientific and artistic, involving both the actor and the geologist. Because in the circumstances we are facing, and I'm quoting Donna Haraway here, it has become unthinkable to do good work in any interesting field with the premises of individualism, methodological individualism, and human exceptionalism. Because theater is a collective art, what I wish to share with you are 3 questions that we explored through 3 different plays created within my company in a collaboration with geologists, science historians, illustrators, and designers. And together, we experimented different ways of representing and inhabiting the landscape. The first question that I would like to share with you is, how can we produce imaginaries of landscape that escape the restrictive alternative of collapse or progress? It is through a play called Matters, which replaces the voices, reenacts the voices of the inaugural meeting of the Anthropocene Working Group members, that we seek a third way heard to move beyond this dilemma. How can we develop practices that transform the eye in the face of the landscape in order to escape the deep toxicity that reduces the landscape to a mere backdrop to our lives, as Frédérique said earlier? It is through another play called Mississippi's, which revisits the tradition of 19th century panorama shows, that we sought to restore interactivity between the river and the beings. And finally, I will try to explore something that is a bit more experimental because I'm still working on it. It's called the Petrifying Museum, and it questions the lithic becoming of our species and the technofossils we introduce into the soil. So Matters is a performance that was created in 2018. Kind of strange because it's a sort of reenactment of an event that took place in Berlin, where the Anthropocene Working Group, so most geologists working on the hypothesis of the Anthropocene, gathered for the very first time on a German stage. So the AKW, this impressive architectural venue with its particularity, its heavy history, it's located in the Tiergarten Park. It was a gift from the Americans to the Germans after the Second World War to teach them what democracy is, ironically. So it was almost on a theater stage that this cultural institution invited the group to meet and discuss this major question, are we now living geologically in the Anthropocene? And one event that particularly caught my attention in the archives of this meeting during the 3 days of discussions was the intervention of historian of science Naomi Oreskes, where she explained that the question of the Anthropocene is not just a scientific challenge. It is a political challenge, it is a technical challenge, an economic challenge, but above all, it's conceptual. She says, we have to accept that some of our key ideas and concepts are inadequate because we don't know how to fix this. And I think this is what this meeting invites us to consider the possibility of some new ideas, some things that maybe we have not yet thought about. And this, I think, is our most difficult challenge. She gives a very eloquent example to illustrate this problem. She talks about the metaphor long used in geology to explain the extraordinary discovery of this discipline. The idea that humans are just tiny specks of dust in the blind, mindless universe with a minimal impact compared to the history of the Earth. So she says, geologists have proven that man is just a very small thing when compared to geological time and the magnitude of geophysical forces. And there are so many metaphors used to imprint this concept on us. But I'll give you the one that I remember most from my own education, which was that our textbooks were filled with some analogy to try to impress upon us how insignificant man really is. One was to imagine geological time as a clock. Now, the appearance of man happens in the very last second of the very last second of the very last minute of the last hour of that day. Boom, that's us. And there was another metaphor. Imagine geological time as your arm, outstretched. Now, how much of human history is represented on this scale? Well, take a nail file and swipe. Swipe it once against the edge of your nails in your outstretched fingers, and you've just wiped out all of human history. How can we replace these geological metaphors with others to understand that humans are now major geological agents, capable of disrupting the Earth system, capable of transforming our landscape on a scale never before seen? How do we accept that we move more sediments than all natural phenomena on a global scale, such as the rivers, such as the wind or ice? We have a cognitive dissonance. And as we began working on the topic in 2014 with both Frédérique, Bruno, and my colleagues from the SPEAK program and in my company, I noticed, as other colleagues, that the Anthropocene generates modes of scientific, political, and aesthetic representation that revolve around a hellish alternative: progress or collapse, like two sides of the same coin. Indeed, the Anthropocene is often presented as the consequences of the Great Acceleration. It is defined by the exponential increase in human-produced outputs on the surface of the planet. From a quantitative point of view, all the curves accelerate in the Anthropocene to the point of leading to a geological shift. This image comes from the performance Moving Earths, where Bruno, so that's me actually now at the Odeon Theatre in Paris. But for Bruno Latour, in this play, written with Frédérique, the depiction of this curve tells the story of a shift in the Anthropocene, that of a growth curve which no longer represents progress, but instead signifies ecological collapse. This disturbing effect regarding a growth curve of goods turning into bad, to borrow the expression from Latour and Ulrich Beck, the curve suddenly reversing is no longer a curve of progress that can grow exponentially and infinitely, but one that signals the collapse of the techno-industrial society. And the only alternative trajectory proposed to counter this collapse in scientific literature is to double down on progress to avoid the first: sustainability or collapse. And this hellish alternative can also be found in both the worlds of arts and popular imagination, as well as in the sciences. The omnipresence of the theme of collapse is a recurring motif in popular culture. And as I began my residencies in various theaters, we witnessed a proliferation of variation on the age-old idea, which here I will simply call, for the sake of the exercise, the end of the world. And it's not just in theater, it was in movies and blockbusters everywhere. And it is surprising that Hollywood, this machine for crafting contemporary imaginaries, cannot find an alternative to this scenario and shows such a lack of imagination. We invented Hollywood, but we sometimes have a staggering lack of imagination. As Frederick Jameson would put it, we find it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. The majority of the stories produced by the Western dream machine imagined as an alternative to catastrophe a landscape populated by flying cars. The world of flying technical objects is undoubtedly one of the most persistent imaginaries in contemporary Western culture, to the point of becoming the only future that is both desirable and at times conceivable. Thanks, Elon Musk. It encapsulates within itself the two escape routes of modernity, the future and the elsewhere, while seemingly freezing the future forever. The crisis of sensibility provoked by the ecological upheavals keeps moderns in a state of paralysis of their imaginative capacities, trapped in the realm of infinite progress, with the only alternative trajectory possible being ruin. It's somehow another point we wish we could continue about science fiction, just Frédérique mentioned earlier. But here, in an attempt to break free from this imaginary of technical solutionism, which occupies all the remaining space in Western world impoverished by progress, the philosopher Émilie Ash advocates for what she calls a return to Earth in the introduction of her collection of texts. And she draws on a short story by the writer Marion Zimmer Bradley in the book The Coming Wave, in which the American science fiction author tells the story of a team of astronauts returning to Earth centuries after their departure. And they discover villages who have lost all enthusiasm or curiosity toward them. For the philosopher, the Earthlings they meet have abandoned any form of space conquests for which they seem to feel almost total indifference. And more generally, they have radically changed or civilized their relation to technology. By stepping away from the progressive and linear narrative that had led them straight to the stars following an undefined catastrophe, the villages have abandoned the escape routes of the future and the elsewhere, choosing instead to build their lives in the present, here and now. And a little bit like this person who wishes to stay and inhabit the present time and a place, for researcher and designer Donato Ricci, who's a good friend of us who works with us on many different projects, it would not be about laboring to produce new narratives. And that's really the point I want to make about how can we escape from this collapse or sustainability alternative. In an article titled Design at the Present Tense, where he specifically reflects on design as a space for producing the future, he argues, we must invent forms capable of surpassing the obsession with the future and its exoticism, forms that resist the present. We could try to design them through and with the thinness and the thickness of the world. They require new techniques of attention and sensitivity, which should be eminently political design techniques. The design techniques I advocate should be capable of projecting and composing a grounded understanding of what is behind, under, and beneath a specific problem, before quickly removing to its critique or solution. We should slow down the present, make it tense and dense, allowing us to realize the objects that populate a specific present reality. And these tensions, techniques are meant to make perceivable how we inhabit the question and by what links and dependencies we are sustained. So our performance matters brings together the many voices of the protagonists who found themselves on stage at the AKV, and it illustrates how while the Anthropocene invokes imaginaries of collapse or progress, it also contains within it a multiple of details, sensitivities, sketches, of aesthetics that open up alternative imaginaries existing with the dominant ones. The performance serves as a manifesto for an anthropology of the near. Everything is already there, and it's in germ, it's void. One just needs to learn to observe it, reveal it, amplify it, and sometimes imitate it. I will try to go a little faster on this one. Sadly, I'm taking much more time than what I expected. But the next performance is called Mississippi's, and it's a performance created in 2022, and it's inspired again by the AKW in Germany. And they did another project, a very strange and interesting project at the same time, where basically they tried to measure the Anthropocenic impact of humans on the Mississippi River. So it was a long trip, canoe trip of 3 months from the headwaters to New Orleans. And with Clément Salé, the researcher and writer I worked with, we decided to follow them and see how they interacted and did this field work. And so it's a performance that reenacts this journey. The team first became interested in a panorama as a scenic device, a form that emerged during the steamboat era in the Mississippi region and has since disappeared. According to the American journalist Lee Sandlin in the book Wicked River, it could be 120 meters long and 5 meters high sometimes. It consisted of painted landscapes from the viewpoint of one of these steamboats traveling down or up the river. So it was super interesting because you had the performer and the musician on the other side of the screen or the panorama. And depending on the evening, they would unfold or fold the panorama. So you would go up or down the river from one night to the other. Different narrative. So the audience Stanley describes the panorama as embodying all the characteristics of American historian William Cronon, who identifies as the narrative of manifest destiny. So it's another image of the paintings that were used of the landscapes. And really, here, a narrative focused on the increasing linearity of progress, telling the transformation of the American landscapes, from wilderness to trading post to farm and to a thriving city. Studying panoramas of the Mississippi helps us understand how the progressive narrativity of modernity affects not only our representation of time, but also our representation of space. The ecological upheavals, particularly those generated by the exploitation of land, people, and creatures, exemplified by the historical and emblematic destruction in the rivers region, which includes both segregationist and industrial exploitation, call for a transformation of these representations. I'm going to move on to another argument because this is taking too long. But basically what you're seeing here, and I'm going to escape now my presentation and go to improvisation mode because I only have, 5 more minutes, Nikolai? Is it okay? Yeah. Okay, 5 more? You can take your time. Okay. So I want to just show you. So that's an image of the panorama that we tried to create for the performance that was really trying to grasp. You can't see it, actually. Sorry. You can see a little bit. All right. So I'm going to show you. I'll try to something. Okay. So basically what we tried to do is that we wanted to capture the Mississippi River, not from the modernistic perspective, from the steamboat and the river. We wanted to capture the Mississippi River from the inside. And so all the images that you see here are images collected on Instagram by the group that did this journey. And so it's only fragments of the Mississippi River, fragments of the pictures that we merged all together to create this alternative view of the Mississippi River. And the speed, it looks really very small, but actually that's the speed of the river, of the Mississippi River. It's 5 kilometers per hour. So as I was performing with the singer, the Mississippi River, throughout the whole performance, was with us on stage, telling an alternative view of the river, giving another sense of time. And that's something I sadly cannot perform to you today, maybe some other day, but here is just a glimpse of what the panorama is about. I'm not going to talk about the landscape in petrified museums. Sadly, I wanted to talk about technofossils and the fact that landscapes could possibly our belonging to the landscapes and the fact that we also will become part of the landscapes, just as Nikolai mentioned with the painting of Egon Schiele at the beginning. I would probably argue that I have a completely different reading of this lecture, and this is something maybe for the conversation, but I think the painting that you showed us earlier shows a lot of petrified entities. And maybe we could also see this painting as the petrification cycle of living beings and non-human beings and beings in general becoming part of the landscape. So I will just end, sadly, quickly. I'm not going to go through all the ideas that I wanted to share with you. I will just end with a song. And it's a song on a video. And it's a song that was composed by Delian Djembe, a singer who did this performance with me. And it's an anthem for the Mississippi River and all the beings that are intertwined together and shape the landscape. So, and that's the one here.
Millions of dollars to do this work. We would move mountains, and people just don't see it, and they don't trust us.
Very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Duncan, for a brilliant exposition of how to perform landscapes from within, and for destroying my argument. Nice. Now, to end up the day today, we have Frédérique Äit-Touati from Studio Emerging Landscapes, and Katrina, who will be in conversation with Frédérique and Duncan for the next 15 minutes. So, yeah, let's go.
Should we go here? Yeah. Here? No, not on stage? I'm sorry, I'm just being maybe an actor, sorry. I'll just sit then.
We can sit next to
Yeah, okay.
Does this one work? Yeah. Then we have to share too. Maybe I should just sit here.
I think that's fine. I think you can start. This is,
Well, first of you, thank you. We've been looking very much forward to having you here. It's truly a pleasure and an honor, and also, how can you say it? You get touched by your approach. And so Theo is a master's student, thesis student, working with mapping. So we think some of the conversation will around that, and some of it will also seen from like a teaching perspective, because you were, for instance, mentioning models and how they could work. But maybe if we start with you now, you start with the sensory. You said, how can we develop practices that transform the eye? Could you maybe elaborate on that, because it's a very strong statement, and it's also really interesting. Do you have an interaction with the audience, or how do you push it forward when you have these?
When it comes to practices, I'd say that it's important that as a theater maker, I don't only create representations, performances, shows that people attend and see, and I think it's also something we try to do in both of our companies. Workshops, labs are extremely important in order to practice our eyes, and it's about being equipped. And I think Frédérique mentioned a lot about changing goggles, glasses, lens. It's really about trying to be equipped. So I really believe that through the practice of workshops in theater companies, with engaging with the public, is a way of doing so, and not only through representations.
Do some of the performances, do they also take place within the landscape of the outdoors, like along the Mississippi in the mud, or?
This performance only happened in black boxes in theaters, but matters, as I said, it's a solo show, and we performed it in every situation, museums, theaters, but also outdoors. So yes, it really depends on the performance.
yeah, I think my question would be related to something like that, the comprehensibility of, especially I think I've looked more into your mappings, and I think of this complexity, the complexity in the data you gather and everything, and then referencing what you said about negotiating with the maps. And I think that was interesting, because there is this there's this line between dealing with complexity, complex data, and then the comprehensibility of everyone that hasn't worked with it for 10 years. What's all the considerations behind turning something that complex into something that can be comprehended by someone who's just looking at it in, a matter of maybe just seconds, and then using it as something to negotiate us back from Mars or down to the Earth?
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to make sure that I understand your question. Your question is about, is it about tools or is it about aesthetics? Or is it about the field? Because in a way, the complexity, the question of complexity is it's the complexity of our world. And as we know, a map is a simplification. And this is the famous saying by Borges, who says that the perfect map would be the territory itself. If you put all the complexity, then you have the territory. So this is the oldest question of cartography, in a way, that you're asking me. The question in itself, for me, is not really complexity versus simplification. It's rather, what do you choose to represent? Because you have to choose. You can't put everything. And what is very striking is that in the history of cartography, we have chosen always the same things. The topography, some natural objects, frontiers, for very, very well-known reasons, because maps were used for military operations, they were used for geopolitical uses, they were used to define nation-state. So maybe when we re-ask, okay, what should we choose? In a way, what we do is a very simple operation, is to ask, what do we want to do with our maps? Can we do something else than using them to know where resources are to be extracted? Do we want to use them to do something else than war? Do we want to use them to negotiate rather than to conquer? You see, it's all those little shifts that make the operation of choice a bit different. But I think it doesn't make complexity more simple. It just makes a little shift in the gaze, in the way you see things. Did I answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yes, of course. It's kind of what I was hinting at, you could say. I think you could take your question in many directions, but I feel like I keep coming back to also wanting to ask about your considerations about your maps being used in a negative way. You just said something about finding materials or taking materials out of the earth, which is quite relevant right now. And what you are doing is unveiling, the underground. And if you ever did, in the process of creating these maps, come to this consideration about the negative consequences that has happened throughout history with maps as well.
Yeah, it's a clever question. We didn't think of that while doing them, because in a way, they are not topographic maps, so they're not very useful. If you want to use them to dig, baby, dig, it won't work with those maps. I remember talking with Baptiste Morisot, a friend and philosopher, who is doing a lot of pistage, what he says, which is a way to follow animals in the forest and in the mountains. And he told me one day, look, Frédérique, I'm sorry, but I can't use your maps to do my stuff. I can use them before going in the field. I can use them to see things differently, to prepare differently. But once I am in the mountains, if I have only your book, I'm lost. And I think this is very important for us to, in a way, to insist on the fact that those maps can be used, but I'm not sure they can be misused precisely because they are not very they're not very direct. You have to work with them.
Different than a navigational map that we were used to, maybe. That's
Yeah, although navigation maps, I didn't show you that, but one of my favorite inspirations in Terraforma are actually navigation maps from the 12th century. They were called portulans, as you might know, because they were showing mostly ports, harbors, and also they were showing liquid space. They were showing the sea. And what we did in Terraforma is to remove the topographic basis of the map. So when you do that, you are in a liquid space. So in fact, navigation maps were a very important inspiration for us, because when you are on the ocean, what you have is current and wind and harbors. So you have to find new ways to navigate. So this metaphor of navigation is actually very important for us. But again, it's about expanding and developing new tools and new maps. And I think this is something we keep doing in a way. Our idea was not to fix a new atlas, for instance. It was not to fix a new geography. It was, on the contrary, to reopen our tools and imagination. And it was really a call to people like you, telling you, please, invent your own maps. Ask your own questions. Make your own tools.
So kind of opening up the spectre of what maps could be. That's kind of the intent with the whole...
That's precisely that. That's why when we said, okay, let's make 7 chapters, it could have been 14 if we had had the time. And I don't want to make any publicity, but yes, I want to in a way, because Alexandra Aren's next book is coming out next week. And she's my great friend and co-author of Terraforma. And what she did was to use our methodology to explore new territories. And this is her PhD coming out next week as a new book. But we have had lots of experiments with musicians, dancers, designers, other architects that were doing their own maps. And I didn't have the time to show you the dozens of maps that have been produced after Terraforma. And we are very proud of that there has been so many other maps than ours.
Yes, great, thank you.
On that note, because are these collected somewhere? If, for instance, some of our students would like to see how this apparently has a rhizomic impact on others trying to do mappings, I would expect them to look different from the Terraforma maps, right? Yeah. Like the Feral Atlas, now you mentioned Anna Singh. Can we see it somewhere if we want to dig more?
We are trying to make yet another book collecting all the maps inspired more or less by Terraforma that we know about. So again, it's another call. If you know this kind of experiments, graphic experiment, we're very interested. Of course, we won't gather all the things, but there's just a very interesting movement linked or not linked to Terraforma at the moment of reopening our representations. And again, we take that as a collective endeavor. It's really somehow in our time, people want to create new representations, what I like to call new cosmograms or new artifacts in all the possible medium. Cartography is one, but the theater, music, for me, they really participate in this reimagination of the terrestrial.
And then it becomes a little bit interesting also in terms of if we're opening up new imaginaries and making our own maps. What is the line then between fake maps and when does it have like a capacity to do something else? I'm asking because you mentioned Trump and Musk, and if we are trying to make new imaginaries as not anti-terrestrial, maybe as a departure in life, how do we see?
You're right, it's a key question. there's a line to be kept in a way. What I find interesting, and I'm sure you know that, is in our little collective endeavor in Terraforma is not imaginary maps. Precisely not. They are grounded on data, on inquiry, on fieldwork, on stories that we were told, on science, on architecture. They are really based on, they are not imagination. I have nothing against imagination, I want to state, because I come from there in a way. I studied the power of fiction in my PhD, so I really, but it's very important and interesting nowadays to ask what kind of fiction do we want. The difference between fiction and lie, between fiction and fake is very important to determine. My way of coping with this paradox and problem is that I make a big difference between fiction, which is used as a tool. Again, as you see, it's a recurring word that I use. When you say that you are doing something as a fiction, which is what we do in Terraforma, it's a thought experiment. It's a fiction in a way. Let's imagine that we are rediscovering the Earth. It's a fiction, but we say it. And when you make a fiction and you don't say it, then it's a lie. And this line is very clear-cut, actually, to find. And in terms of maps, I was stunned, like you, I guess, last week or 2 weeks ago. We can't even count the time because Trump just, is just taking, adding a new crazy idea every day. But I don't know if it was last week. He said, look, the Gulf du Mexique is becoming America Gulf. It's a mapping. How to say that? It's a pure cartographic gesture, which becomes a geopolitical military gesture. And here again, we go back to the old use of map as military tools and weapons. Sorry, I'm lost in my answer, but I guess it just underlines the importance of holding our cartographic tools and not leaving them to fascism. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for a very precise and also, how can you say, combining aesthetics with specificity in a way through these cartographies and not only a claim as in the Mexican Gulf or the Panama Canal. I've been asked to open up to a few questions to all of you. Is that okay with the... So, I guess since you asked, you had a question.
No, I was just passing on.
I was just wondering if anybody had any questions.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for this. I'm also quite interested in this retooling of our eyes and our scopic regimes, which we work with, and also from let's say decolonial pedagogy point of view or point of life, as you stated. And I'm wondering if this retooling of how do you see the interaction between the retooling of our eyes with the existing imaginations we have on governance? Because maps are tools of governance, and they shape the way we imagine ourselves in relation with authority of all sorts. And yeah, thank you.
Well, this is much too big question for tonight, but I'm just interested in the speed with which those governing tools are evolving. Tomorrow I have to fly back south because I'm invited to give a talk about AI. I'm sorry to bring that here, but it's part of this extremely quick shift into tools. And thank you for bringing that in the conversation. And again, we should discuss that with a glass of wine somehow and take the time to unfold the question, because what I find very important, and maybe one thing I can try to state clearly tonight, is the importance for me to keep hold of those tools, whether they are maps, large language models, tools of surveillance, observation, graphic tools, tools of representations. The only way to survive this wave we are seeing at the moment is to be able to make our own tools. That's the reason why it's so important for me to be in this kind of school, architecture school, because you build things. You don't let computers do things for you. And for me, this is maybe one of the lessons Bruno Latour gave us all together, the importance of materiality. What we are talking about are not metaphors. That's why we are doing theater with Duncan. That's why we are making maps with architects. That's why we make alliances with designers. Because without those alliances, with only our thinking or text, we can't do anything. So for me, really, the question is how to reclaim, as I was saying earlier, those tools of governance and representation.
I think we will have to end now, since it is now 6 o'clock. Thank you, Frédérique and Duncan, so much, for also, and Theo and Katharina, for reminding us that it is a work in progress, of course, to re-situate ourselves within landscapes and to map the world anew. Thank you for coming, everybody. Next time we have a public lecture will be the 10th of March, where painter George Rui will be investigating again what it means to inhabit a landscape, how they are, let's say, shaped in painting. So thank you very much, and please help me give a warm goodbye to our guests here.